I gotta believe that as an ADHD woman entrepreneur, by now you've realized that procrastination works. It helps you get stuff done. But did you also know that it actually can exacerbate your ADHD symptoms? Let's talk about it. So, first of all, I wanna talk about why procrastination works. People who do not have ADHD brains, people with neurotypical brains, are able to motivate themselves using things like importance, rewards, and consequences. That is, if someone's like, hey, this is important, they can get themselves to do it. Or if you think something is important, you could get yourself to do it. Or if there's a reward or a consequence. And not that that never works with ADHD, but it just doesn't work as consistently because our brains are wired differently. And some of that wiring means that we are not getting the same amount of dopamine. And dopamine is something that our brains need for executive functioning. So you may have heard people talk about executive dysfunction in the ADHD brain. And I prefer to say it's just a difference. And it works differently because we don't have access to as much dopamine. Our brains often need something to increase dopamine for us to want to do something, especially if said thing is uninteresting to us. This is why, as a kid, you may have heard something like, well, you can focus on this video game or this reading this book for fun, but you can't do your math homework or something like that, right? It's not that you couldn't focus at all, and that's where the error with the whole ADHD, attention deficit disorder name is that it's not a deficit of attention. It's difficulty directing attention and then sustaining attention, especially on something that's uninteresting. And again, this relates back to our way our dopamine is accessed in our brain or not having access to enough, I should say. So the deal is, in order to get ourselves to do something, it needs to be interesting. But what do you do if you're like, I have to do my taxes and you find that incredibly boring? Or what if you need to write your blog or do some content and you find that incredibly boring? Well, by now you've probably figured out that if you wait, that creates a sense of urgency. And guess what? Urgency makes it interesting because it's like, oh my gosh, can I get it done by the deadline? Right? It makes it like this challenge. And so now you're motivated to do it. But here's the problem. You are dysregulating your nervous system when you do that. Did you notice? Like, I even need to take a breath. When you are rushing to get stuff done, that doesn't mean you're not going to do a good job necessarily. But what it does is it's putting you in your fight or flight response so that you might be pushing and pushing and pushing in your fight or flight. And then you might even crash going into your shutdown response after. Those are protective responses. Those are responses of dysregulation. And they're not bad to be in if a tiger is chasing you. They're not bad responses at all. They're needed. It's just that to do that repeatedly is actually exacerbating your ADHD. And here's why. Those protective responses, the fight or flight response and the shutdown response, are meant for survival. They come from, I mean, it's very primitive. Even reptiles had this in their brain in evolution. It is your body or your brain going, danger, do something. So one is the fight or flight response is a response to perceived threat. And then the shutdown response is to perceived like, yep, this is the end. There's nothing we can do. And so everything shuts down in the body and the brain. Well, not everything, but it mutes things so it doesn't hurt as much when bad things happen at the end, right? And that's a problem if you're putting yourself in that response over and over. And a lot of people in today's day and age do because so many people are chronically stressed. But if you're doing it to get yourself to do something, you're actually making it harder to focus. Here's why. If a tiger is chasing you, right? Because your brain doesn't know the difference between a tiger and a project that you've procrastinated. If a tiger is chasing you, it doesn't matter if you record your podcast. You just need to get away from the damn tiger. So if you want to get stuff done with ADHD, it's not that you can never use procrastination, but if you rely on it, you are disrupting your ability to focus and motivate yourself to do things in the future. And especially if you aren't doing anything to regulate your nervous system regularly, to come back to that baseline state, that ventral vagal state where it's safe enough to connect, rest, and digest, that social engagement system. And so, even though procrastination works, it's important to find other ways to make things interesting. And I'm going to share two of seven that I teach. One, novelty. If you can add a layer of novelty to something that you're doing, even if you're doing it for like the millionth time, find a way to add a layer of novelty. I think that's why I like doing my podcast so much, is because there's novelty because the topic's different every time. So it's kind of fun. I do right now I'm doing a weekly workshop on overcoming invisible ADHD obstacles. And even as though it's the same workshop every week for 5 weeks, actually, I think by the time I'm done, it will be six. I just added another day. There's novelty because the people who show up are different and I wear a different shirt and it's a different time of day. And so there's novelty to it. So add a layer of novelty to something to make it interesting. You can also add a layer of creativity. And for me, when it comes to like anything that has to do with planning, color, I add color to things, whether that's different color pens and markers or sticky notes, or if I'm doing something on the page, I'll use different color fonts. Um, different color fonts, different, yeah, I guess that's what you'd say, different colored text. To make it more interesting, to make it stand out. So those are two ways that you can get yourself to do stuff with ADHD that won't end up exacerbating your ADHD by constantly triggering your protective responses. Try it out.